in describing your Mastercard position, I sort of left out that you were the U.S. trade representative.
Kind of a side gig.
Oh, that.
I try and forget that too at times.
So if you are free to also comment on what you saw in government, but I also want you to talk from your perspective now, where if you look over Mastercard generally, you're part of it, the Center for Inclusive Growth. How do you see the kinds of people we'll be training having stints in the private sector, or as I said, your job at Mastercard sort of straddles public purpose and private profit?
So, first of all, thank you for having us. And I want to introduce Nicole Lindsay, who's here from the Center for Inclusive Growth and represents us on the advisory board. Let me start by saying I'm in violent agreement with everything Cecilia said. And there really is this is an incredibly important initiative. We're delighted to be supportive of it. And it's so important to be able to bridge that gap in understanding and involvement between these two seemingly separate worlds. And let me give you 3 examples that we're involved in, that we're trying to explore in addition to this partnership. One is to help develop cyber talent. And with Microsoft and with Workday, we have a fellowship program where we put cyber talent into the government for a couple of years and then get them a job in the private sector so they have an understanding of the government's perspective on cybersecurity, and then can help bridge that gap with the private sector, and we waive their student loans as part of this overall activity. That's 1. 2, and we should talk about cities as Axios. We've taken on the issue of opportunity zones, which is a pretty controversial tax credit that was in the Trump tax bill. Bipartisan support. Cory Booker, Tim Scott were the primary proponents of it. It could end up being a windfall for real estate developers, or it could end up being one of the most powerful forces for investing in distressed communities that we've seen in recent history. It turns out at Mastercard, we have some data, quite a bit of data on spending. Now, the good news is, by the way, we don't know your name, just so you know. We don't know your name. We don't know what you buy. We have no personal information. But we do know where money is spent, when it's spent. And we know, for example, if somebody who probably lives in this neighborhood is traveling 4 miles away to go to a grocery store because there are no grocery stores in their neighborhood, and there's a food desert. And we're beginning to work with mayors all over the country to help them understand what their opportunity zones look like, how they compare one to another, and how they compare to similar zones around the country, and then how to use our data both as a baseline to be able to show what progress is or is not being made through this tax credit, but also as a way of attracting investors into their opportunity zones and saying, you know, we'd really like to see a grocery store and a retail complex built in this neighborhood. We have the data to show you that there is demand in the neighborhood. And so that's how we're using it. And I'll mention one other example and then come back to really your question, which is the 3rd example is a partnership we have with the Rockefeller Foundation. Sorry, Darren. To do a data science for social impact collaboration. And our first joint project is a grant to Datakind, whose job is to work with NGOs, and we're hoping to encourage them to do it with governments, to help them even understand what is the data they have, how to clean the data, what data hygiene means, how to formulate an appropriate data science question, and then brings in volunteers from the private sector, data scientists, to help that nonprofit solve whatever issue they have. We're trying to help get them to scale, make them relevant to governments, precisely for the reason you said, because the digital divide that we're now very concerned about is the digital divide that's emerging between the private sector and the civic and government sector. There's so much advance going on in the private sector every day, every week. The tools are incredible. The platforms are incredible. We can do all sorts of things now that we couldn't do 6 months ago or a year ago. And yet those tools are not being made available to the nonprofit or the government sector. And we need to find ways of bridging that gap. And one way is in training people training technologists to go into public service. And even if they don't go into public service, one reason I use the Datakind example is we've got 500 data scientists sitting in St. Louis. We want them, some of them will be willing to take 6 months and go volunteer for an NGO. Some of them may actually go work for a government agency at some point in their life. But we also want to give them the opportunity to spend 4 hours every Friday afternoon working on a data science for social impact project, and giving them that experience to understand what the social sector and the government sector needs. There's a huge Mars versus Venus problem going on here, as you all know. And President Joe, I don't know my Cicero, but I do know that Pericles once said, you may not have an interest in politics, but politics has an interest in you. And for those of us who've spent time out in Silicon Valley with our friends out there, and Jeremy's here, for up until 2 years ago, they would say, oh, Washington's irrelevant, the political system's irrelevant. We're just gonna change the world by being able to tell your refrigerator, tell us when you're out of milk and things like that. They're now understanding that they actually need to understand politics and society, morals, ethics, what government agencies really look to do, what their priorities are, because those government agencies are now very much interested in them.